President-elect Donald Trump is heading to Washington to meet with Senate Republicans as they craft a strategy for the beginning of his second term. White House columnist Niall Stanage joins us to discuss that and much more. Niall, Trump is meeting with senators this evening. He's going to meet with House Republicans over the weekend at Mar-a-Lago. There is still this question burning over legislative strategy. Are they going to do one big beautiful bill, as Trump puts it, that would incorporate tax cuts, border, energy production, maybe even debt ceiling, or they're going to break it into two bills? It strikes me that the actual heavy lift here is going to be, can they get conservative hardliners to spend a bunch of money and run up the debt? You know, because Republicans have a lot of ideas of how they want to spend money. I haven't heard any concrete ideas or how they're going to cut a bunch of spending to decrease deficit spending.
Yeah, exactly right. And there's a fundamental tension there because Trump is a populist, and populists don't tend to want to take spending away to actually deprive people of government programs or to not spend money on things that would be popular. It is typically unpopular to take spending away. You're quite right that there hasn't been very concrete plans offered in that respect. And so I think there is a real problem as to how you keep the Republican conference, the Republican coalition together, because of course that encompasses very hardline fiscal conservatives as well as more orthodox figures, and of course also some Republicans who are representing fairly competitive purple districts who want a wholly different thing.
How difficult do you think it would be to thread that needle and find big pieces of legislation that everyone can agree on?
Well, this actually goes to the whole debate about whether it's one big beautiful bill or two, because one of the arguments for one big beautiful bill, for those who want it, is there will be something there that will appeal to everyone, and therefore you can get it over the line. The danger is a more pessimistic interpretation of all that, where you say in one bill there will be something that everyone objects to. And so advocates of the two-bill approach suggest that you want to get the border spending immediately in one bill and then leave the more difficult political horse trading until later.
Senate Republican lawmakers are making a list of Biden administration regulations they want to repeal. They're in a bit of a time crunch. At first, the first priority, they say, is to approve Trump cabinet nominees. Then there's this effort to use the Congressional Review Act to repeal these Biden regulations. They have just 60 days to get that done. The list includes a bunch of consumer protection, environmental type regulations that the Biden administration has put out. What do you see as the most impactful regulatory rollbacks that they're going to pursue? Well,
I think obviously we have just seen President-elect Trump complain pretty vigorously about President Biden's use of an executive order to exclude a vast swathe of American waters from new offshore drilling permits. I think just because there was such a furor over that, and because Trump himself took it up so vociferously, that's likely to be one of the things that they will target. But it is one of the big ideological differences between the parties. Democrats typically favor regulation because they see it as safeguarding environmental standards or other issues that are important to them. Republicans overwhelmingly much more skeptical of government regulation.
We're continuing to follow reaction to President Trump's press conference yesterday. One of the highlights were these threats to essentially have land grabs in Greenland, Canada, Panama Canal. Dick Durbin, the top Democrat on the Senate Judiciary Committee, is asking the Department of Justice to clarify limits to a president's ability to use military force on a number of fronts. Are members of Congress and the global community at large taking these threats seriously?
I'm not sure how seriously they are really taking them. It's certainly true that Senator Durbin wants there to be greater clarity over a president's war powers. But is he doing that because he really thinks that Trump is about to annex Greenland, or is he doing it as a way to highlight the controversy inherent in making that sort of a proposal? There's certainly a lot of pushback within the European Union and elsewhere on the Greenland issue. And similarly, Panama would be, that'd be massively controversial. The Panama Canal was ceded to Panama based upon agreements that the late Jimmy Carter agreed to. So that's been a long-standing issue, and I don't really think we're about to try to seize it by military force.
On Friday, the U.S. Senate is planning on voting on this bill that cracks down on undocumented immigrants. It's the first bill passed by the House in the new Congress. It aims to deport undocumented immigrants charged with certain nonviolent offenses. 48 House Democrats voted with all Republicans to pass it through the House. Several purple state senators, John Fetterman, Gary Peters, Ruben Gallego, say they're going to vote for it. You know, progressives complain that this is a slippery slope because you're threatening to deport people who have just been charged with a crime, and that could incorporate some people who are actually innocent. But can we judge the Democratic support that we've seen so far as a willingness, at least on the part of some Democrats, to take a more aggressive approach on immigration?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for two reasons. One is that there isn't really any doubt that the immigration issue writ large hurt Democrats in November, hurt Vice President Harris, but also hurt Democrats lower down the ticket. I think there is a public desire for a more strict policy in that respect. But also there's the emotive element of this bill. The Lake and Riley case was so horrific. And so I think that a lot of Democrats are wary of getting on what they would see as the wrong side of that. And it's just on a basic moral basis, it's quite hard to argue against the idea that people who are arrested for crimes in this country who are not authorized to be in the country in the first place should be permitted back in, to have their freedom.
President Biden says that he could have beaten Donald Trump in the 2024 election. The comments came in a wide-ranging interview for the USA Today with Susan Page. He also admitted that he doesn't know if he has the vigor to have lasted another 4 years. Doesn't seem ideal. But and he also said that President Trump, when they met in private, that Trump complimented him on his handling of the economy. You know, it's an interesting interview. One of my biggest takeaways from it is that Biden does have a record that he could have run on, but even in this interview, at times he was speaking too slothfully to be understood. He mixed up stories. It could be argued that his inability to communicate, as exemplified even in this interview, cost him a shot at a second term of his presidency and dug Democrats a hole that they couldn't end up digging out of.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. There are very bright spots in President Biden's economic record. He was not able to persuade the public at large of that. Public dissatisfaction with the economy in particular was quite deep and quite wide. Now, part of that may be just that the political wound inflicted by inflation earlier on in his presidency was impossible to escape from. But I think you're quite right to draw attention to the issue of his capacities as a communicator, which have pretty obviously diminished, and also the public concern about whether he could really serve another 4 years in essentially the toughest job in the world. Obviously, a vast swathe of the electorate had real concerns about that, and when those concerns were sharpened by that disastrous debate performance, that ended up with obviously his party pressuring him to step aside.
What about this ongoing question of whether or not he could win, whether or not strategically, at the moment when Biden got out of the race, that was the best move for Democrats? Do you think that has implications going forward? Is that going to split different segments of the Democratic Party? Are they going to keep reliving this battle over who was right and who was wrong on that front?
I think that President Biden is in a small minority, even within the Democratic Party, in believing that he could have won. The whole reason there was that dramatic sequence of events was because most people in his party believed he was basically certain to lose to President-elect Trump in November. There is a different debate about whether Biden should have declined earlier to seek a second term, should have stuck to the idea of him being a transitional president. I think that is a debate that can go on for a long time, but I'm not sure how much it divides the party because obviously President Biden is leaving the political stage, not just leaving the presidency. So it's not as if there's going to be this sort of tight knot of Biden loyalists who are, trying to get him back to be president again. That's not going to happen.
He talked about passing the baton in that interview, but it seems like he might have been a victim of his own circumstances a little bit after relative success in the 2022 midterm elections. I don't know if there was an off-ramp for him to exit the race and go a different direction. But we'll leave it at that. Niall Stanage, White House columnist here at The Hill. Appreciate your insight.
Good to see you.
President-elect Donald Trump is making a last-ditch effort to block sentencing Friday in his hush money case. In an emergency application to the U.S. Supreme Court, Trump is asking the justices to prevent the prosecution from moving forward until appeals go forward that claim presidential immunity. In other legal news, Attorney General Merrick Garland revealed in legal documents his plans to release a report on the federal investigation into Trump's efforts to interfere with the 2020 election. Joining me now is the Hill's courts and legal reporter Zach Schonfeld. Zach, let's start off with Trump's attempt to block his looming hush money sentencing. New York prosecutors have until Thursday at 10 a.m. to respond to Trump's emergency application. By default, the appeal will go to Justice Sonia Sotomayor. Could she make the decision alone, or will it go before all the justices?
Justice Sotomayor could technically act on this alone. Each Supreme Court justice has an area of the country that by default they are in charge of handling emergency matters from. So Justice Sotomayor, as part of her assignment, that includes New York. But the court oftentimes on major emergency applications, they will be referred to the full court, all 9 justices for a vote. And it's pretty difficult to think of a more major or pressing matter than the first ever criminal sentencing of both a former president and president-elect. There's also practical reasons, too. If Justice Sotomayor did want to act on this alone, Trump would then have the legal right to try to keep renewing this request to all the other justices down the line. So there's some good reasons to think that the full court will take the vote here. But also, I do think it's important to point out that the timing here is just so short. This application came in this morning about 48 hours ahead of the sentencing. So there is a possibility that we'll get an interim order called an administrative stay, which only temporarily would put the sentencing on hold until the Supreme Court can resolve this request more fully. If that were to occur, you would likely see that from Sotomayor herself rather than the full court.
Do you see there being legal precedent for Sotomayor to lean on, or will it be up to her to interpret the law to make a ruling?
There is precedent in terms of the criteria that the court looks at in these emergency applications. This is not coming to the court on its normal docket, so it is held to a much higher bar. Emergency relief is supposed to be reserved for only the most extraordinary of cases. Now, of course, the president-elect's team has argued that this is that case. This is, unprecedented circumstances and all of that. So there is some criteria and some precedent on that, but we really are in uncharted waters here. The Supreme Court, of course, has never had to deal with now the first ever criminal conviction of a former president and what to do with his sentencing now that he's just under 2 weeks from taking the oath of office.
Attorney General Merrick Garland has responded to Judge Eileen Cannon's ruling to block the release of Special Counsel Jack Smith's 2-volume report in a court filing with the 11th Circuit Court. Garland says he would only release 1 volume of the report. What do we know about Garland's plans and what's next in this legal battle?
This filing indicated that Garland only intends to publicly release the volume of the Special Counsel Jack Smith's report that deals with Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election, his case in Washington, D.C. that has been dismissed. But this filing at the same time indicated that Garland will not publicly release the other volume of the report, which deals with the classified documents case down in Florida. And that's because although Trump's charges have been dismissed, he has 2 former co-defendants, his valet as well as a property manager at Mar-a-Lago, who are still facing charges, at least as of now. So because of those pending charges, Garland said he's not going to release the other volume of the report. But at least as of now, Judge Eileen Cannon's ruling is in effect that prevents him from releasing the report at all. So this fight is now going to the 11th Circuit, the Federal Appeals Court, to decide whether to wipe that ruling or not. This is being heard on a very fast schedule. They've asked for the final brief to be filed by 5 p.m. today.
Sounds like the only report of these 2 that has a chance of seeing the light of day before January 20th, when Trump takes over, is the January 6th investigation. Is that your take on this?
Yeah, that seems like a pretty safe assumption. It seems pretty safe to say that once Trump gets into the White House, once he takes control of the Justice Department, any part of this report that's not out in the public light yet, Trump is not going to want to see the light of day. We've seen his criminal defense attorneys, taking aim already at this report. His lawyers have actually had an opportunity to review it in private. They say that it's making comments not only about Trump, but they've criticized it for also making comments about his members of its incoming administration. And of course, these very same criminal defense attorneys are some of the same attorneys that once Trump takes office are his nominees to take control of the Justice Department.
In other legal news, the North Carolina Supreme Court has blocked the certification of Democratic Justice Allison Riggs' election win for the state Supreme Court. While 2 recounts have shown Riggs holds a 734-vote lead, Republican candidate Jefferson Griffin is questioning the validity of 60,000 votes. It's interesting that the state's highest court is weighing in on an election for a seat on its own court. What do we know about what's next, and is this considered controversial by the Republican-led court?
This ruling is just temporary. It temporarily delays the certification of this very close race until the court can resolve the case fully. So this order also set up a briefing schedule for this case over the next few weeks. And this has to do with Republicans' challenge of about 60,000 ballots in North Carolina for reasons like voters not providing information about their driver's license or even their social security number. Of course, President-elect Trump won North Carolina, and pretty handily. It was one of those first swing states called on election night. But this state Supreme Court race is very, very close, just about 700 votes out of more than 5 million. So this challenge over 60,000 ballots really could dictate what the outcome of this race is. And of course, along with it would have implications for the state's highest court. State Supreme Courts across the country have really been coming into increased focus in recent years, especially now that there are no more federal constitutional abortion protections. That issue has been returned to the states, and a lot of state courts are now having to deal with these implications of these Republican efforts to ban abortion. So there's been a lot of attention and also a lot of spending on all of these races.
All right, Zach Schonfeld, thanks so much. Appreciate your insight.
Thanks, Drew.
The Department of Homeland Security Inspector General has confirmed that his office has begun an audit of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, also known as FEMA. The audit was initiated in mid-December over concerns that FEMA's employees were showing bias against President-elect Trump's supporters. According to a letter shared with The Hill, the investigation will look into reports that the agency avoided homes impacted by recent hurricanes when they had Trump bans yard signs. One FEMA worker was fired late last year for allegedly telling a Florida assistance team to bypass houses with Trump signs. The worker says she was following orders of a superior who issued the directive for a specific time period and neighborhood after FEMA workers experienced a pattern of aggressiveness from disaster victims with Trump signs in their yards. FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell testified in court testified in front of Congress in November, saying she believes the occurrence was not a part of the agency's practice at large. The Justice Department is suing 6 major landlords over an alleged scheme to keep Americans' rents high. The DOJ says the landlords used an algorithm to help set rent prices and also shared sensitive information with competitors to boost profits. North Carolina, Tennessee, Colorado, California, and 6 other states are also suing the landlords over the rent scheme. In all, the 6 landlords operate more than 1.3 million units in 43 states and Washington, D.C. The lawsuit comes as rent is at an all-time high. Current figures show the majority of Americans spend more than 30% of their income on rent and utilities as wages struggle to keep up. Another port strike could be on the horizon, sending businesses bristling at the potential economic impacts. Tens of thousands of longshoremen spanning the country could walk off their jobs next week if their union and management can't resolve long-running contract issues. The potential strike comes a little under 2 weeks until President-elect Trump takes office again. The strike could be damaging to Trump's plans for the economy as he starts his second term. The International Longshoremen's Association went on strike this past October when the union and the U.S. Maritime Alliance failed to reach an agreement. Trump has voiced support for the longshoremen in the past, and the head of their association says he shares a strong relationship with the incoming president. Both sides have until a deadline of January 15th to resolve any concerns and come to an agreement. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.